everybody. I'd like to take this moment to welcome you to our luncheon and to thank you for attending. This is Lunch with the League of Women Voters. And I just wanted to point out that today our attendance was so high that we actually had to purchase a new Zoom capacity. The attendees for today's event they exceeded our capacity. So we purchased an upgrade to Zoom to accommodate everyone here. And I want to thank you all for attending, and particularly thank you for your donations, because your financial contributions help us defray the cost of bringing these programs to you. So welcome, and we're going to start off with some technical instructions to help people who might be struggling a little bit, and then we're going to go through some announcements, and then the program will start. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim, and she's going to talk you through the technical aspects.
Hi, everyone. Before we get started, please note that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be shared with the public through our website. All attendees' microphones will remain muted, so if you think of any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A icon on your Zoom screen to submit them. If you're having any trouble hearing or seeing the webinar, please send us a message using the chat icon on your Zoom screen, or using email. Just reply to the Zoom reminder email that you received this morning, or send a message to program@lwvsandiego.org. To you, Lori.
Thank you, Kim. So for those of you who don't know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We were founded 100 years ago this year, in fact. The purpose was to empower a brand new block of voters who had just fought and won the right to vote, and it was women. So as many of you might know, this year is also the centennial anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. That was a 72-year struggle to get that amendment ratified. So that's a little bit of background on the League and its founding. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all the levels of League, just briefly, because I have some information on each of these levels that I want to share with you today in attendance. So as I said, we're a national grassroots organization, and we also have state leagues and local leagues like this one here in San Diego. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our league here, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about national, and then to lead into our discussion today, I'm going to talk to you about state. So our league here, as you all know, hosts events like this. We have Lunch with the League each month, and we also have a meeting on Saturdays that we provide similar information regarding topics of interest. So I want to give you a little bit of information about our upcoming event. It's our July Saturday meeting. It's the topic that day is going to focus on education and the changes for the 2021 school year. You may have read a really interesting commentary by Voice of San Diego editor Scott Lewis about a month ago. He questioned the support for schools and children in school during this pandemic, and he raised a lot of interesting questions about how we are going to get our economy back moving again while parents are having to stay home and teach their children without the school's support. So we're going to have him come and speak to us on that topic, and we're going to explore that on July 11th, and that you can register for that just like you did this. It will be on our Eventbrite page, it'll be on Facebook, it'll be on our website, and registration is exactly like this registration. So I hope you will join us and take time to participate in that. It's July 11th, and like I said, we'll have information on that on our website. We also have these monthly luncheons. Our next luncheon is July 22nd, and our program committee is actively looking at about 5 different interesting topics and speakers to line up for that. So we'll hope you will check in on that as well and join us for that when we pull that information together. I'd like to talk just briefly about National now. So National League every other year hosts a convention, and it just so happens that this week is currently the National Convention. Without the pandemic, many of the people you see on your screen, Kim, Fran, myself, we would all be in DC right now, attending caucuses and preparing to vote on league business. But because the pandemic has restricted our interaction, we're hosting these, or the National League is hosting its convention remotely. So I just wanted to tell you the National Convention, or the National League, does a lot of excellent work. The convention is just one part of it. They do support through legislation and lawsuits, et cetera. Anyway, it's just a really exciting time right now for the league. Not only is it our anniversary, but like I said, the convention is going on. And with that, I just wanted to put up front, as soon as I hand this off to Kim, I in fact will be leaving this luncheon with the league so that I can go do a caucus at the National Convention. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my little discussion here with a discussion about your state league. So the League of Women Voters of California also is very active, and I'm going to share with you right now a couple of things that the state league is doing that relates specifically to what our topic here is today. So as I said, we are a nonpartisan organization, and voting is a nonpartisan issue. And so we're on the forefront of voter rights, and we take every opportunity we can to secure those rights and guard against suppression. So we have filed, the state League of Women Voters has filed motions to intervene in 2 lawsuits, which both contest Governor Newsom's executive order that included sending all registered voters a vote by mail ballot. So you might, if you've kept up with this, you might remember that last Thursday, the lawsuit that was filed by former Congressman Darrell Issa was made moot when the legislature passed and Governor Newsom signed AB 860. And that piece of legislation codified Governor Newsom's executive order for vote by mail ballots. But there's another lawsuit pending by the Republican National Committee that in part complains that vote by mail leads to fraudulent votes, which, quote, from their lawsuit, dilute the votes of honest citizens and deprive them of their right to vote in violation of the 14th Amendment. So the state league, along with several other voting rights groups, filed a motion to intervene in this lawsuit too. And yesterday we were told that motion was denied, but the court did leave the door open for us to file an amicus brief. So I'm just keeping you updated on this status. So the state league is consulting with our attorneys and the coalition that we've been working with on these lawsuits to figure out how best to move forward. So I just wanted to update you all on the status of the state league, to let you know what they're doing as it relates to the topic today, and to set up this discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Kim. I'm going to say a quick goodbye while I go to the National League's convention event. And good luck, everybody, and have a great discussion. Thank you all.
All right, so we have our 2 speakers today, and I'm going to introduce the first one. Michael Vu was appointed in December 2012 as the San Diego County Registrar of Voters, and he previously served for over 5 years as the Assistant Registrar. He is responsible for election administration of one of the largest election jurisdictions in the country, with a registered voter population of 1.8 million. Mr. Vu oversees all primary, general, special, and district elections for the county, as well as elections for the surrounding municipalities. After his presentation, I'll introduce our other speaker, Francis Carrillo. So go ahead, and there you go. I'll turn it over to you, Michael Vu.
Good afternoon, or I guess it's not afternoon, it's lunchtime. But I appreciate the opportunity to present always before the League of Women Voters, and I want to celebrate with all of you the 19th Amendment, the ratification of the 19th Amendment this year. So I do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, all of those of you who are watching. It's unfortunate that we cannot meet in person. I can't wait till that day when we are able, and I'm able to present to all of you in person. But this is probably the next best thing. Who would have ever thought that we would be doing so much remote and distance presentations that are out there? So I really do appreciate the opportunity. And frankly, this is the first presentation I have given since this all started, as it relates to the November election, and frankly, for all presentations since we certified the March presidential primary election. So hopefully all of you can see this here. So since the March 3rd election, our office, after we certify the elections, has really not caught a break. Normally after a major election, there is some degree of being able to take time off, but ultimately, as soon as the March 3rd election was certified, as many of you know, we all went into quarantine and how best to be able to combat and stop the spread of COVID-19. But our office continued to be here at the Registrar of Voters office as we've moved towards certifying the elections office. And then subsequent to certifying the election, we were then able to move most of our folks into remote working and really to start talking about the November election. The Secretary of State's office formed a task force, which San Diego County was on, and with many other counties as well as advocacy groups on those task force conversations to talk about how we were going to be able to conduct November's election in light of COVID-19, not knowing what the certainty and spread would look like at that specific time. So our office has really not caught a break. Half of the team was able to go and remote work, whereas the other remaining folks had to remain here at the Registrar of Voters office, is because our office, elections, is an essential infrastructure. According to the Department of Homeland Security, that was made an election essential infrastructure some number of years ago after the 2016 election. And it is an essential infrastructure, and our folks had to stay here. Some of our folks had to stay here is because we've been processing and verifying a number of statewide as well as local petitions. But let me talk with you about the go forward plan to the extent that we know of it. And most of this is still in conceptual conversations, and we've been modeling out how we would be able to conduct the November election. So nothing is here set in stone at this point in time, but ultimately, as you can see from my first slide, that we are changing our messaging. Today is 132 days away from the election. That for some may be an eternity, but for us, it's moving at the speed of light. Normally, we would have been preparing for a big election as we were going to have in November's election 4 years ago when we finished up the 2016 presidential general election. And so we're really moving at the speed of light, and we really are working most likely as many hours as we have been when we were conducting in the full throes of the March presidential primary election. So we really have not rested on any of this. And the reason why is because we really have, although the election is 132 days away, we have much less number of days to execute and implement this election, from the mail ballots themselves to the voting locations, which I'll talk about in great depth of what that looks like. And then also to contend with COVID-19. So what are our election goals for the upcoming election? Well, certainly it's to balance between integrity, accessibility, security, and transparency, which is always a mainstay of elections. Now, doing so in conjunction with how to do that in a safe and healthy voting environment. To drive awareness around this, because the pivot that we're about to embark on is larger than we've ever seen in the shortest amount of period of time. And I've always said that you cannot turn the Titanic on a dime like we are doing this with an election. So this is a major change, not only operationally and administratively for the Registrar of Voters office, but for the public as well. And so there must be a robust and huge public awareness campaign of everything that we are planning to do, and to educate the public about the San Diegans that we have, the voting public in San Diego, about how the election will be conducted. Thankfully, I think San Diego County, as well as the state of California, is in a pretty good position in that we don't have a presidential primary election in front of us like other states had to hold their primary in the face of COVID-19. But we have a little bit more time in terms of our preparation for the November election. And even though that little bit of time is not a lot, as I mentioned. And then also to educate voters about what does the polling place environment look like? What does in-person voting look like for the upcoming election? And as you can see to the right of your screen, you will see our new logo that we will be launching in terms of our campaign to ensure voters know what our plans are for the upcoming election. And so for the very first time, you're getting to see our new Vote Safer San Diego logo that we'll be using as part of our main messaging on all of our sample ballot pamphlets, all of our mail ballot packages, and any other news releases, media releases that we would be sending out to the general public. So what are the impacts of COVID-19? There are many impacts as it relates to, and that we've been contending in your respective lives. Certainly I'm a parent myself. I have 4 kids and 2 of them are still going to school in grade school. And certainly that has impacted my wife and myself. But it also contends with work life as well in so many different ways than just remote working, but also in terms of how we need to prepare not just ballots, but also the amount of PPE equipment and items that we need to purchase to ensure that individuals that would come to the Registrar Voter's Office or get to an in-person voting location can do so in a safe and healthy environment. So what are the major impacts that is impacting the state as a whole, and why did we start having state conversation immediately after the March presidential primary election? Well, there are 2 main factors here, and that is the uncertainty of where COVID-19, how long it would last, the duration of it, and the impact, overall impact it would have on the operations and the administration of elections on folks that are employed here at the Registrar Voter's Office, the plans associated with it, and then ultimately to voters at large. So the 2 main impacts, at least from the administration side, is our poll worker population. Many of our poll worker populations are 65 plus in age, which are our high risk population as it relates to COVID-19. Additionally is the uncertainty of securing and having availability of our polling locations. And so what does that look like overall? Well, this is our poll worker population from the March 2020 election. And as you can see here, the highest population of poll workers, volunteer poll workers that we have is the 65 plus population. And then if you even consider that 60 to 64 population and add that to the 30%, 41% of all of our poll worker, volunteer poll worker population is potentially in this high risk area as it relates to COVID-19. So how do we contend with the possibility of not having enough poll workers? And normally we hire and bring aboard and recruit and train 8,000 to 9,000 poll workers. As you've heard me say before, is we become one of the largest employers for one day. And part of that is because we bring on so many different poll workers on board to serve on election day. But as you can see here, 30%, 1/3 of our population of volunteer poll workers may not be able to serve or would be available to serve. And the concern is would we feel right to even ask those individuals to serve, knowing that they are in this high-risk population? So that is something that we're having to contend with in terms of the overall impact. Moving forward is the polling place impacts that we have. As you can see here, we have, out of the 1,548 precincts that we had, 1,063 or 69% of voters that were assigned to these respective precincts went to a private polling location to vote. Okay, that is, these are private facilities, whether it's a person's home, whether it's a business. 69% of voters that were assigned to a specific polling location went to a private location. That means that 31%, again, this 30% is resonating here, is a public location. And so for us is, how do we secure sites that may no longer be available to us, particularly if they are private locations, when we need to ensure that social distancing needs to occur, and whether or not a location may allow us to use it, a private facility may allow us to use it one day, but then turn around closer to the election and pull the rug underneath us and say, no, we cannot use it because there has been potentially a spike of individuals that have been tested positive for COVID-19. How is that going to all work? Certainly, we have seen some of the circumstances that have occurred in Georgia, in Nevada, in other states like in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, and some of these other states that have conducted their presidential primary elections. Certainly, we saw those, some of the things that happened in New York and in Kentucky too. It seems like those went fairly smoothly, but we heard of all these other states. Well, some of these stories that are coming out is the locations themselves had to be changed at the last minute, potentially causing confusion on voters where they would normally go to. So how do we create certainty and confidence for ourselves as well as for voters to ensure that if they are needing to get to a in-person or a polling place, that they can do so without it potentially being changed last minute? And so that's a factor that we need to consider as we are mapping out November's election. Also, the social distancing aspects of it. As we're looking at these respective facilities, again, we cannot use a person's garage. It would be, frankly, too small. So we're looking at facilities, public facilities, that are greater than 2,000 square feet in space to allow for social distancing, to allow for voter capacity as well, knowing that the November 2020 presidential election is going to be the highest turnout in a 4-year cycle. It may be one of the highest turnout that we've seen in our lifetimes. Now, as I say lifetimes, it'll be interesting because the highest percentage voter turnout was 84% during the 2008 presidential general election. The last 2016 presidential election, we had an 81.5% turnout. And if we looked at the last 4 presidential general elections, the average percentage turnout has been 79.5% turnout, which is great, which is amazing to see that high of numbers in a presidential general election. And I anticipate that our numbers will be at minimum 79.5 to or higher in terms of its percentage turnout. We will ultimately see. There's a lot of factors associated with that. But ultimately, the space, the voter capacity, and the surge that we expect on any given presidential general election will occur on election day. And so how do we meet at that expectation and the assumptions that we're making about how many individuals we believe will go out to a polling location and polling place on election day and allow for social distancing? And again, there's this balancing that needs to occur. Geography, when we cite any of our respective locations, we need to ensure that that we are a very diverse geography and ensuring that there's a balance between urban versus rural and unincorporated area, and not and so that there's a level of accessibility in that regard, but also accessibility in all the other fronts that we talk about, whether it's ADA, socioeconomic, transportation corridors. All of those are taken into account as it relates to this notion of using public facilities for polling locations. Now, we may not be 100% able to secure public facilities. In that regard, we're building to plan Bs of what private facilities are out there that would meet some of these requirements that we have out there as we're planning the overall elections. For example, would YMCA facilities be open to allowing us to use it for as a voting location? And then the other thing is I put here, this is more of an administrative item, is the election structure itself. We are a very complex county. Normally we had the last presidential election, we had over 650 different ballot types in the election. I anticipate with all of the jurisdictions, the political jurisdictions that have changed from a at-large form of government to a district form of government, that's kind of like, you know, changing from everyone voting for city council members at large, everyone in a city voting for all the respective city council members at large. It would be, most of these political jurisdictions are now turning to a district form of government, similar to the city of San Diego, where there are 9 city council members, and only those that are living within that city council district can vote for those council district members that are candidates. So we've seen a lot of surge in that number of political jurisdictions that have changed from 2016 to 2020 presidential election, and will for the very first time move towards a district form of government. I see that increase in terms of the total number of ballot types. And so we're making an assumption that we may see upwards of 700 ballot types in the election. And that's not including all the materials that now need to be translated into the 5 different federally covered languages that we have. Just to let you know as well is that we are now covered, not federally covered, but state covered under the California Voting Rights Act for 2 additional languages. That is Lao as well as Japanese, that we have to provide some election materials in those respective languages. Specifically, the ballot, we have to translate the ballot in specific precincts for the ballot, and then also take a good faith effort in recruiting bilingual poll workers for those respective languages on top of Spanish, Filipino, Vietnamese, Chinese, and then also the other 2 state covered languages that we're already covered for, which is Korean and Hindi. I'm sorry, not Hindi, but Arabic. Okay. So that needs to be taken in consideration as the total number of ballot types, because when you break up the county in so many different pieces called ballot types, because we're all only available and eligible to vote on our respective contests that are available to us, that has to be taken into consideration as we're mapping out the overall election. Okay, so what has happened since to provide some level of certainty? Well, you had the governor, as Lori had mentioned, that there were 2 executive orders that the governor signed off on, one in May and then one in early June, one calling for every single voter being mailed a ballot, and then the second one spelling out what in-person voting location options there were for elections officials. So regardless of where you stand on that issue, it is ultimately 2 things. One is to provide certainty in terms of the public as well as for our office. We were, frankly, our office as well as all elections officials within the state were clamoring for some level of certainty. Now, we had our positions on how that should occur and what the thresholds occur, but ultimately the governor and the legislature is moving in, for the most part, parallel fashion as to what November's election is going to look like and what the options are for elections offices throughout the entire state. So there's the 2 governor executive orders, and then you have SB Senate Bill 423 and AB Assembly Bill 860. Assembly Bill 860 has already passed. That was passed approximately a little over a week ago, and SB 423 is working its way through the legislature to codify the governor's executive order and provide clarifying details on what those things are. So this is kind of a recap of what those executive orders will do. As I mentioned before, all registered voters will be mailed a ballot for this upcoming election. And then part of the executive orders is to give us direction in terms of the in-person options that are available to us, specifically the ability to consolidate more heavily the total number of precincts than there has been allotted in the past. And then if you take that option, if an election official or a county takes that option, then those locations would need to be open for a minimum of 4 days, starting October 31st through November 3rd. And then there's this establishment. One of the big aspects of this is the establishment of mail ballot drop-off locations. Many of you which have served as one of our mail ballot drop-off monitors at our 62 drop-off locations, well, we would need to now expand to one for every 15,000 registered voters and continue that program for approximately a 29-day period. And then finally, the use of the Secretary of State's online mail ballot tracking system, which we've already signed up for, and it's called Ballot Tracts. And then, as I mentioned, Senate Bill 423 and Assembly Bill AB 860 is moving to codify and provide additional details that we need as elections officials, as well as to the public. Okay, so what does that look like? So here's kind of a recap of what I just mentioned. Mail ballot voters, 100% will be sent a ballot of voters that will be sent a mail ballot. In-person voting options, the way I see it, is there are 3 options on the table. One is the traditional polling place model. And as I mentioned before, there are big and major impacts associated with that model because of the total quantities of polling places and individuals that we would need to have serve to continue that option. There's the consolidated option, which is this threshold of consolidating precincts, no more than 10,000 registered voters per polling place that we could exercise. But part of doing that is you would need to open for 4 days. And then also what would come with that is the mail ballot drop-off requirements of 1 for every 15,000 registered voters for 29 days. And then there's this Voters' Choice Act model option, which would require Board of Supervisors approval to be able to do so, which is essentially what I call essentially a free-for-all model. Any voter can go to any respective location in the county, which many of you know is one of the concerns that I have to do and pivot like that in a presidential general election or presidential election to begin with. That would be just too big of a turn from my point of view. And so I have never been a proponent of trying to move towards a Voters' Choice Act model for a presidential election year, even though there have been a number of other counties that have moved towards that model in this past primary election or even in 2018. And then finally, the requirement is there are really no voter education campaign requirements that are out there in terms of if you select the traditional polling place model. There's always some level of education campaigns that is written in the elections code that we have to provide voter education efforts, but nothing solidly in terms of what our existing programs that we already do from all of our voter outreach coordinators that we have on board that go out to all the respective communities, all the ads and radios, ads that we place out there, and now the social media aspects of it. What would that look like for, what did it look like for us in the March election? Well, 74% of the electorate already vote permanently by mail. So that's what I mean by San Diego is in a good position, is because really, if we're going to send everyone a mail ballot, well, that means that we're only sending out to 26% additional mail ballots out to all voters out there for the November election. So from that perspective, we're already well positioned. There's already a culture of voting by mail. There are all of the different protections and safeguards that we have in place of voting by mail, and we continue to refine those and enhance those and new laws coming on in place as we are made aware of them. The traditional polling place model is what we conducted. We had 1,548 precincts, polling places that we had out there. Physical sites, we had approximately 1,350 physical sites, but we had 1,548 voting precincts during the March election. We had 62 mail ballot drop-off locations that ran for 7 days, and then every single voter was assigned a specific polling place should they want to vote at a polling place during that March 3rd election. And then, as I mentioned before, we had 9,000 individuals serve as a volunteer for us, as a poll worker for us. And then for the March 3rd election, we had specifically a party status campaign around the presidential primary election, that your political party status did matter for that election, and generally doesn't matter for any other election, including this upcoming November election, except for in the March 3rd election. So we ran a very robust campaign and had the League of Women Voters as part of that. And so I do appreciate the League, and as well as all the interested organizations. Doesn't matter whether it was a liberal or conservative or one type of advocacy group or another. Everyone really did come on board and resonate and reinforce that message about making sure that voters knew what political party status that they were in and to change it in advance of the election. So I do appreciate all the efforts that have occurred there. So what does November's modeling look like? Well, as you can see here, this is kind of some of the modeling that we would do. Required, we are required to send out 100% to voters a ballot. So we will do so for this upcoming election. But when it comes down to in-person voting, what does that look like? And this is where a lot of the time that me and my team have been spending is, if we took option number 2 and consolidated our precinct, what would that look like for us, considering all those different factors that I showed you on the previous slide, from urban and rural and unincorporated to the ballot types and the election structures that we would need to do? What about our public versus private facilities that we would have out there? So as we map out this election, and if we took this consolidated precinct model to its greatest extent, what we are seeing is that our minimum, based off of the 1 for every 10,000 registered voters that the law requires and that the governor's executive order talks of, well, we would actually have more sites, because of administratively our ability to conduct elections would require us to do more. Plus, we've been looking at queuing theory, surge capacity, how many people we anticipate are going to go out potentially for to a in-person site. And so what we're looking at is more locations as opposed to the minimum of 1 for every 10,000 registered voters. So we're looking at identifying 235 approximately locations, public facilities, to run for those 4 days. Again, that would be Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. When it relates to the mail ballot drop-off locations, I know where the governor's executive order says, which would require the 1 for every 15,000 registered voters, and the legislature is moving in the similar fashion on that, and we would have to have them open for 29 days. From my perspective, and what I stated to the state, I believe that this was, that the requirement was too high. I think that was certainly too much, and potentially not a good use of public funds, because we have a great program in place here in San Diego County with the 62 sites that we currently have and running for those 7 days, because all of our statistics, everything that we're looking at from a statistical level, says that it's the last 7 days when voters and voter behavior occurs, particularly the last 3 days. And any chart that you've seen me present on shows that there's that huge spike, and it starts growing starting on that Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So unfortunately, or fortunately, we will ultimately see, this is ultimately the requirement, is that it's 1 for every 15,000. So what that does to us is we would effectively double the total number of mail ballot drop-off locations that we would have out there in the county, and we would run it 3 times longer than we currently do with the 7 days, actually nearly 4 times as long than we currently do today. So, and we're identifying where those respective locations are. As many of you know, many of those locations that we use right now are libraries. They have been a great centrally strategic location for voters to know where those are. We anticipate that we'll be able to do that, but we are needing to get those individuals on board, and particularly with COVID-19 and the impacts that they're having there. And then identify new locations as well. We won't need as large a space, but we'll also need to contend with the whole COVID-19 and what the actual interaction with the voter will be when they bring their mail ballot to these respective locations, should we go with this model. Voters assigned to a polling place, unlike a vote center model, we would assign voters to go to one of these 235 locations. So it's this blend between a traditional polling place and a vote center model. And then how many workers would we need and volunteers would we need? We're looking at about 3,500 election workers, which we would see as paid election workers as opposed to volunteers. So our folks would, these election workers would be poll workers, but would be a paid hourly poll workers that were out there. Again, by doing so, it allows for certainty and allows for to identify folks that have robust skill sets, qualified skill sets to operate at a super poll sites, because we would be introducing a higher level of technology to each and every single one of these 235 approximate locations. And then, as you can see here, our messaging moving forward will be Vote Safer San Diego campaign, and then our hashtag will be Vote Safer SD. Okay, I'm going to continue going a little bit quicker here. As I mentioned, we have the capacity to meet the 26% out there, both from a front end perspective of how do we get it out to the voters, as well as getting and handling and processing all the mail ballots as it gets back to us. So we've invested over years, both the equipment, processes, and staff to be able to meet the demands with sending everyone a mail ballot. Additionally, we're looking to procure additional equipment internally to the office to handle the higher capacity for all of the returning mail ballots. And then we're going to need to extend outside of our building. As big of a building as it may look like, we only are a staff of 68 individuals, permanent staff members, but our staff grows upwards of 1,200 additional people. And because of the social distancing requirements, we're going to need to expand outside of our building to do specific activities. And we are looking to do so closer to and on campus to be able to do that. But here again, these are the impacts that we're having to contend with and map out and get everyone on board to be able to use these respective additional locations as well as space. And then one of the requirements associated with Assembly Bill 860 is the ability for voters to use something that was required starting January 1st of 2020, which is this remote accessible vote by mail system. It was the first time that we used it during the March 3rd election, and it was for people that were with a disability and people that were military and overseas voters that were deployed. Well, now, according to Assembly Bill 860, this is going to be expanded to all voters to have the ability to use this option out there. And there is information on our website if you want to know more about what that option and what is the remote accessible vote by mail system look like and how does it function. Essentially, we would email you the ballot. You would still have to mail ballot back your return voted ballot through the mail or drop it off to one of these in-person sites or at the post office. And we're highly encouraging the post office in that regard. And then, as I mentioned before, we would need to operate and begin process. Oh, I haven't mentioned this, but we would have the ability to process mail ballots 29 days before Election Day. Before it was essentially 14 days in advance of Election Day. But with Assembly Bill 860 passing, we now have the ability to process with more days available to us. And then finally here, accept Election Day postmark ballots. So normally there was this law called Postmark +3 is what we called it internally. Elections officials would call it internally, where a ballot had to be postmarked by Election Day and received within 3 days after Election Day for it to be accepted and timely cast and to be able to be counted. Now the legislature is moving towards expanding that to 17 days after Election Day, knowing that we're sending everyone a mail ballot. Okay, and that is Senate Bill 423, which has not passed yet, but is highly anticipated to pass. Okay, what does in-person voting may look like for November? Should we go with a consolidated polling model? It would, again, voters would be assigned a specific location and there would be paper ballots at these respective consolidated polling places based off of their ballot type, as I mentioned, and assuming that we have about 700 ballot types on average, looking at those 235 locations as we're modeling this out, that's 3 ballot types per location. We would, as opposed to having a board, a volunteer board of poll workers of 4, we would have an average of about 15 hourly paid poll workers at each and every one of these sites running for 4 days. And then consolidated polling places would be equipped with more technology than they have in the past, which includes the purchase of additional electronic poll books. Now, if a person shows up at the wrong site, we would still be able to help them and be able to have them cast the proper ballot that they are eligible to vote on. But assigning a person to a specific site helps us in terms of surge capacity. And I'm a big believer that voters want to know and have a level of instructions as well as direction as to what they need to do to be able to vote in the upcoming election should they get to a in-person site. And then, as I mentioned before, is the big push, even though we will have these in-person sites, and depending on whatever model that we would have, the big push would be to have them vote their ballot and return it through the U.S. Postal Service. Although we would introduce 124 mail ballot drop-off location under a consolidated polling place model, there are thousands of mail drop-off boxes that the U.S. Postal Service. So why not leverage that to the extent possible, knowing that the I voted sticker is in everyone's mail ballot package now, and the fact that every mail ballot is prepaid postage. Okay, conceptually, again, the conceptual model, what does that look like from a traditional voting precinct model? And what does that look like from a consolidated? Let me show you what that would look like. So that's March's election, or what voting precincts looks like, and this would be what consolidation of voting precincts would look like at the tune of 1 for every 10,000, but no more than that. And then what would the assignment of these consolidated, what we're kind of internally calling super poll sites look like? That would be kind of the overall distribution of what it may look like. Again, this is, again, a conceptual modeling for you to be able to see, but nothing concrete about it at this point in time. And voter outreach and education, Vote Safer San Diego is our message. We do have anticipated, we have mapped out a very robust communication plan out there, which would include sitting down with all the various interested organizations like we did during the March election and multiple times to really draw out all the different chronological milestones that we would hit that these interested organizations would be able to be informed on, so that they could then reach out to their respective constituents and members as well, on top of all the social media, news releases, press conferences that we will be holding for the November election. And then we plan on doing a number of countywide mailers, direct mailers to voters that are out there to message about the governor's executive order, about every single voter being mailed a ballot, the verification of a person's residence address, as well as their mailing address in advance of us mailing the mail ballot to them, and the in-person polling places. Should we go down that path? What does that look like? And then the encouragement to vote their mail ballot and return it through the U.S. Postal Service. Okay, so some of the election mailings that we're putting together, as you can see here, is 90 days before. Is what we're contemplating is sending every registered voter, active registered voter, a mailer that would look like this. And on the back side of it would ask voters to verify their residence address as well as their mailing address, and to update it if it's different. That's certainly very important, because when we send out the mail ballot to them, we're only able to send it to them based off what we have on file. And if it's incorrect, or if they've moved, if it's changed, if they no longer have a mailing address, we need to know that information, because we do often get times where voters will call in and say they didn't receive their mail ballot, to only find out that we had sent it to their mailing address, and they weren't aware that they had put their mailing address as their place for their election material. So that is important to project and to inform voters to be able to do that. We did something similar to this during the March election, and so it was pretty successful, and now we intend to do it for this upcoming election, because it's equally as important. Okay, so that's 90 days before. After, at 40 days before the election, in between, we certainly would do all the social media and radio and TV ads associated with what we need to inform the public on, and to have that resonate and reinforce the public of how San Diegans will vote in the upcoming election. But this is our sample ballot pamphlet cover. Again, it's reinforcing the message of Vote Safer San Diego, as well as the governor's executive order that everyone will be receiving a mail ballot in their mailbox. Okay, and then 29 days before the election, we will be sending out everyone their mail ballot, and there will be, when they open up their mail ballot, there will be additional information that will be a change for them. But again, it's to get it out in front as to why they're receiving this mail ballot. We're working on what is known as the wrap internally to message that appropriately. So when they open up their mail ballot package, they'll be able to see their ballot wrapped around a specific message that we will be conveying to all of them. And then after the 29th day, I anticipate there may be one more additional mailer to all registered voters. What that may look like, we don't know yet. But again, it would be some reinforcement tool of the mail ballot and the in-person voting locations of what that will look like. Some of the things that we're doing with the U.S. Postal Service is leverage the various mailers that we're doing is to leverage their mail piece design analysts to ensure that what we are designing will get to voters in the best possible way. We are also planning on using the informed delivery campaign. I'm not sure how many of you are signed up for informed delivery through the U.S. Postal Service. Essentially, it's an email every single day that you get, and it's an image of everything that's going to be in your mailbox that day. I'm signed up for it, and it looks like that currently we have 635,773 San Diegans who are using the informed delivery, where they get an email every day so they can see what's in their mailbox. So, for example, if there's a question about, when am I going to receive their mail ballot, they can see it potentially in their mailbox through their email because there's an image tied to it. And then the U.S. Postal Box locations that you can see here, we plan on leveraging to let voters know that they can find, where all of the different mailboxes that the U.S. Postal Service serves. Finally, we do plan on using Ballot Tracts, which is another tool and required by the governor, as well as the legislation that I've mentioned already. And through the use of intelligent mail barcode, a voter will be able to track their ballot to and from. So as we're mailing it out in all the different stopping points that the U.S. Postal Service handles that mail ballot, and then tracking it back until we receive it to our office. And so that it will be available to voters come this November election. And then finally, a call to action. This would be our message to not just the league itself, but to the many organizations that we interact with on a daily basis, and hopefully many more organizations that would come on board to really communicate to the public and all the members and constituents and the lay voters that are out there about how this election is going to be conducted. If there is one thing we know from all the different experiences of all those states and counties and jurisdictions that ran presidential primary elections or primary elections under COVID-19 and the confusion that it created, it's the fact that we needed to inform them sooner rather than later and to create certainty for them. And so I would ask all of you on this call to ensure that that you're confirming your address, that your family members, your friends are confirming their addresses, whether that's the residence address as well as the mailing address, if we do have a mailing address on file for you, encouraging them to vote their mail ballot and return it through the U.S. Postal Service, and of course use all the different means to be able to either return it to our office or to track their mail ballot. And finally, knowing that there will most likely be a limit in polling places available out there, is to use the polling place if needed and as an alternative should you need to do so. And having said that, that is my presentation.
All right, thanks very much. That was a ton of information that I'm sure was interesting to all of us. We have about 20 minutes for questions with Michael Vu, and then we're going to go to Fran Carrillo to hear about what the league is doing for our candidate forums and prop talks and all that. So if you do have a question, please click the Q&A icon at the top or bottom of your screen and just type your question in there. We've already received lots of good ones. So let's start with one from Beryl Flom. She's mentioning that we, in the 2 weeks before the March primary, the league was getting about 15 calls a day. And almost every person said that the ROV told them to call us. And most of them needed help registering to vote, or they had questions about where to vote or what to do with their ballot. And so we're wondering why those calls are being referred to us. We think you have a staff of people who can answer those kind of questions.
Yeah, I don't know what in context other than what you're saying and the question that's being posed, but we would not refer simple questions about registering to vote or where to drop off a mail ballot to any other organization except for ourselves. So I'm surprised by the question, but know that organizationally, we have all of our call centers are instructed and trained on where they can find resources in terms of where all of the mail ballot drop-off locations are, as well as how to register to vote. Simply, the registering question is probably the low-hanging fruit answer, and something that everyone in our organization has the ability to answer, which is online, sdvote.com. There's an online, state tool for people to register online. So I'm surprised that you were getting those types of calls, that they were being referred by our office. We can certainly look into that a little bit more, but I've never heard that until now.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, of course, we're always happy to help, but
yes,
I think you guys are the best source of information for that kind of stuff.
And let me just say that, yeah, we do pride ourselves in being the source of truth in terms of elections and how to vote or how to register to vote, because I know that there are concerns out there about interactions with third parties, whether it's registering or whether it's things like handling of a person's mail ballot. So I've always said is if there are any concerns or questions around it, to directly communicate with our office as opposed to potentially third party source. So again, I'd be interested to do sidebar and get a little bit more details as to how those questions were posed and for me to dig into that.
Okay. And then Mary Thompson asked, will ROV consider spearheading a media campaign, including a full-page newspaper ad on election integrity that would include LWV and widespread community members?
So we're looking into that in terms of overall. I know that, let me just say, there's a couple of things on the table. So right now the legislature has allocated in the budget approximately $100 million. $65.5 million of that is spearheaded towards just the administration of the election, all of these executive orders and the legislature's mandates that have come down. The other $35 million is, by the way, that $65.5 million, $65 million is coming from part of the stimulus package that Congress passed and the president signed. So that's part of the CARES Act that the state is receiving. The other $35 million is state funds, and there is nothing certain about those funds, but I know that there's a big push to use those funds for public education purposes, and only for public education and information purposes. So depending on how much money we get from that, we will certainly use that money to do things like potentially a full page ad to informing voters, or other ways that voters are receiving information. So I know that we have to really be cognizant of how many people are really seeing newspaper ads anymore, or are they really looking at a Facebook or a Twitter or Instagram out there? So to try to balance it out there, but we do have some thoughts around what that all looks like at this point in time. So nothing's off the table at this point.
Okay, thank you. Someone else would like to know if San Diego has experienced any cyber attacks directly or directed to our voting processes, and if you could share any details.
More recently, I think the answer is no, that I've been aware of. Having said that, though, let me just speak from speaking with the county's chief technology officer, CIO. The county as a whole, any public entity, not just the county here, is always getting hit up multiple times a day, thousands of times a day, of people trying to do phishing attacks and that type of stuff. So outside of that, that is happening all the time. But when it comes down to something targeted, I would say is no. We didn't see anything related to the March election. Now, as I said that, during the 2012 election, there was, when we were trying to release election results out after 8 p.m., what I've been told is there was a denial of service attack, where it wasn't necessarily the election results were compromised. It was the fact that we couldn't push out the election results to the public. And so those are things that we are monitoring constantly. We have the great thing about the county is that, and the support of the county is that we have a full infrastructure around this. It's not like other counties in other states where elections offices, they're all things for elections, including cybersecurity. No, we have kind of the backing of the entire county, as well as industry grade, as well as vendors looking at and monitoring 24/7 about any type of phishing attack and culling those out even before we even receive them, or things like denial of service attacks where we're monitoring IP traffic and cutting those off should we need to be able to do so. So it's good because I don't get to be needing to worry about cyber attacks as much as my focus about the administrative handling of the election, because there's a core team of people, many people looking at that, as well as the various technology to buffer ourselves.
Okay, good. Well, we have 18 more questions, and I don't think we're going to have time for them all, but we'll see what we can do here. If you have received a mail-in ballot, how do you vote in person?
So if you received a mail-in ballot and you don't choose not to vote that mail-in ballot, we always tell voters to bring that mail ballot with them to a polling location, their assigned polling location, and surrender that mail ballot, and they'll be able to vote a regular ballot. If we introduce electronic poll books to the mix, which is the path that we're under, we'll know everyone's disposition of their mail ballot and whether or not they returned it. So if they, for example, they did not return their mail ballot or bring their mail ballot with them, we'd be able to still suspend that ballot and reissue them a regular ballot at the polling place level.
Okay, good. What exactly does it mean to process ballots ahead of election day? Would the ballot counting begin?
That's correct. So right now it's 14 days in advance of election day where we can start after we've verified, once we've received a person's voted mail ballot, we're able to verify the signature from the envelope against the reference signature on file with our office. And once we've cleared that, then starting right now, this law says is 14 days in advance of election day, we can start opening, extracting, and scanning in those ballots. It's not counting the ballots, it's scanning in the ballots. And then at 8 p.m. on election day, we hit the compile button, and then we can release the election results to the general public. But by only until election day do we ourselves know what the election results even look like. No one else knows those, including ourselves, up until election night at 8 p.m. We know about a little bit sooner than that because then we generate the reports and then, of course, push it out at approximately 8:05, but not sooner than that. Now, with the legislation, we're able to start processing 29 days in advance, so it gives us an additional 15 days.
Okay. If a voter doesn't verify their address after the 90-day period, will they still get a ballot, or do they have to take in another action?
So no, this is ultimately for us is when we push out this countywide mailer, all we're asking voters to do is verify their residence address and mailing address. And if it's still correct, great, they don't have to do anything. If they are, if there has been a move, they've changed their residence address, or if they've changed their mailing address, we need to know that information, and we need to know that information approximately 54 days in advance of election day. And the reason why is because we have to print out 1.85 million mail ballot packages, and so we have to have our vendor be able to receive that data to be able to start printing well in advance to then drop it 29 days in advance of election day. So I believe that's October 5th. So all that time is necessary to, and the data itself, which is the voter's record, needs to be kind of locked in. And if not, then what will happen is we will send them their mail ballot to whatever residence or mailing address we have on file. And if they re-register afterwards, what we will do is and find that out, then we will suspend that mail ballot and update their record and then send them a second ballot. Okay.
Great.
So every mail ballot is tracked. Every mail ballot that we send out is tracked, and we have the ability to suspend and then reissue. So we know that there's no double voting that is occurring and safeguarding the overall election.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any concerns about the Postal Service? We've heard rumors that they're running out of money and they might not be there for us in the fall.
So our conversations, certainly we're hearing the exact same thing. At this point in time, I'm not concerned with the viability of the U.S. Postal Service at this point in time. Frankly, have heard this in other presidential general elections and presidential elections about the U.S. Postal Service running out of money. But at this point in time, the conversations I've had with the U.S. Postal Service is not one of concern in that regard. If there is, ultimately, it would be a very big impact, and not just in individuals receiving their mail ballot, but it would also be concerning because that is the way we are able to maintain our voter rolls as well. Because any return election material that we send out, we have the ability to update voters' records based off of that information. So, so I anticipate that we will be able to use the U.S. Postal Service, and that's what we're looking at this point in time.
Okay. Can someone still cast a provisional ballot at one of the alternative in-person polling locations?
The answer is yes. And so
Okay.
with the use of electronic poll books, we believe that there will be many less provisional ballots that would need to be cast because we'll know the disposition of a person's mail ballot, which we didn't know before, and that's the highest number of population of people that vote provisionally. But the simple answer is yes, we would be able to cast. So the only time that a person that we could see voting a provisional ballot is if they're a conditional voter registration voter, or it's because we've already accepted and counted their mail ballot.
Sure. You talked about the health risks of having older workers. Could they be accepted to work the November election, perhaps by signing a release of liability for COVID-19?
I think we're going to have to consider that. It'll depend on how many people we can recruit to serve on those respective 4 days. So the answer would be yes. And we'll ultimately see whether or not a waiver is going to be necessary. But we are working with our public health officials. And frankly, we have a meeting with them this Friday to kind of go over what that would even look like from an in-person voting location. And also part of that will be this conversation about the poll worker population itself.
Okay. And then someone has asked you to clarify, in-person polling places will be open October 31 to November 3?
So if we go down this path of the consolidated polling place model, yes, then the requirement is October 31st through November 3rd. So October 31st through November 2nd would be most likely whatever the business hours runs at those specific locations. But certainly on election day, all of the respective locations would need to be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on election day, like they are any other election day that is out there. If we kept with the traditional polling place model, certainly then it would be just a one-day affair.
Okay. Given the fact that there are lawsuits challenging the all mail-in ballot order, would you advise people who are not currently registered as a mail-in voter to go ahead and register as mail-in voter as a precaution in case of court orders overruling the governor's order and legislation?
Can you ask that one more time, Kim? I'm sorry.
So should people who are not currently mail voters switch to that just in case this thing does not go through where everybody gets a mail ballot?
So I think that's a moot issue at this point in time. I know that Lori talked about there is still one pending lawsuit out there, and that's perfectly fine. If they want to sign up to receive a permanent mail ballot, there's no harm or foul to be able to do that at this point in time. If you want to kind of create contingencies and kind of a plan B that's out there. Ultimately, for us, whether it's 100%, 75, 74%, or somewhere in between, we'll be able to match that capacity.
Okay. Maggie said that walkability to polling places is important since people are afraid to use public transportation. And she was suggesting that schools are the most well-distributed facilities countywide. And someone else asked if it might be wise to use parking lots of public high schools to maybe as accessible drive-through or walk-up drop-off locations.
So that is exactly what we're looking at is schools. And we have sent out to all of the schools that we've identified that has the greater than 2,000 square feet in space, letting them know that there is a need to use their facility in this upcoming November election. because of the social distancing requirements that are out there, and we're waiting for responses back. As you know, school is out, but in the past where we would just send out a letter through the U.S. Postal Service, we've actually mailed everyone sent them an email, and we've done it. Normally, we send it like 60 days in advance of election. Now we're at 130 some odd days in advance of election to give them due notice that we need their site for voting purposes. How that will all come about is a larger conversation of concern that has risen up to the state level. I am on a task force right now to talk about situations where we may be impacted and there are maybe facilities that we cannot use, and to try to draw on resources to get to the right connections to get these locations open and free them up for our office to use for election day and these additional 3 days as we map out this conceptually from a consolidated polling place model.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I have one last question. It's kind of a long one. Would drop-off locations require someone to be there physically to sign off on the ballot, as they have historically in San Diego? Or would they follow other jurisdictions where one can just drop off a ballot into a drop slot? Having only recently moved to San Diego, I have always lived in jurisdictions where I could just drop off my ballot in a 24-hour-a-day slot requiring no physical sign-off. I was almost unable to vote in the last election due to San Diego's in-person limited hour restrictions.
Yeah. So there's just not enough time in the day to get through the procurement process. One of the things that we're seeing as well is not just the procurement process, but elections is a cottage industry. There's only so many people that make specific things. And with everyone moving more towards mail ballot, the question is are there enough vendors that can create all this material, whether it's printing of ballots? Some of these states that you're hearing, like in the state of Georgia or Virginia, where they're more leaning towards polling place voters than they are mail ballots, but now they're seeing these huge surge. They were having difficulties of finding vendors that could meet that respective capacity. In the same way, time is just too short. And so we are moving forward with trying to identify locations, and they will be staffed locations, not just because of the procurement of the equipment, but the fact that we need to then get all the various permitting that we need to go on to bolt down a potential mail ballot drop-off box that is out there. And the other thing about this is we don't know what the future looks like. We don't want to procure all this equipment and then find out that we have no use for them in the future. Mail ballot drop-off boxes may be a little bit different than that if we could get past a huge amount of hurdle. And for me is we just don't have enough time in the day. If we put all of our efforts, and this is one of the concerns that I mentioned to the legislature as well as the consultants at the legislature, is we cannot have so much of our time and efforts trying to find 124 locations or 62 more locations and try to get through the permitting, try to get through the procurement process, when we've got 90% of this needs to be focused on things like the mail ballot population, things like the in-person locations that we need to find, the proper PPE that we need to purchase, the staffing that we need to find that are qualified on this. That's a huge effort. So as much as I appreciate the concerns, we are moving forward with a staffed model, even though there are limitations in terms of the hours that they would be available. On the other hand, the other purposes as well that I should say is that the staffed, we've found success in staff locations, not because of the sign up. There shouldn't be any sign up. What we're trying to identify is voters that have not signed their mail ballot. And so a monitor, one of our mail ballot drop-off location monitor, is always asked to ensure that the voter has signed the back of their envelope, because when they get back to our office, we find out that voter has not signed their mail ballot, and then we're having to then contact them. And if they don't respond to us within the statutory requirements, then we cannot count their mail ballot. So this assures them two things: protections around that we're going to get their mail ballot back to our office. And then number two, that they are handing it over to a person that is sanctioned by our office. And then two is that three is the signature is on that envelope.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We know you've got a really difficult job with all these changes and making a huge pivot in the middle of a pandemic. So we appreciate that you took some time out of your day for us, and thank you for sharing all that information. If you need to sign off right now, that would be perfectly fine. We understand. And then I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So Frances Carrillo is chair of LWV San Diego's Voter Empowerment Committee. She's also our treasurer, and she plays an important role on our marketing and communications team. She works full-time as an associate business manager for an architecture and planning firm in Barrio Logan. In her spare time, she is treasurer for the Women's March San Diego and Women's March California. She also participates on the State League's Finance Committee. And Fran has just a short presentation for us to let us know, to update everyone on how the League is handling our own pivot to taking things virtual for all those activities that you normally see us in person for at this time of year. So Fran, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think the presentation by Michael was really informative, and we're going to share with you a few of the ways that our own league has been adapting to the changes. I'm going to share my screen here. So for the league, under voter empowerment programs, we have 4 large programs, and that's voter registration, candidate forums, prop talks, and Voters Edge. Basically, we all are about voter engagement and getting the vote out and education. So these are just some of the ways that we're adapting to ensure that the vote does happen. And I think what's important too is that one of the things we'll be doing is working very closely with the ROV in ensuring that any updates and information on voting changes and practices will be passed on to our members and followers. As far as voter registration, we're going to have 2 trainings that will happen virtually in July and August. As you heard from the questions, the league does get a lot of calls and questions about how to register to vote, and we do often refer them for online access to SanDiegoVote.com, which is the ROV's website. But at the same time, we're going to make some pivots ourselves in helping people to understand how to do that online. Hopefully we will have some opportunities to do some in-person registrations. So we will be doing trainings in July and August. We'll be promoting any of the updates from the ROV about voter status, how to vote, and any opportunities that come up. We also are working on getting the vote out activities. We're hoping to text, phone, and do postcards so people can do that safely from your home, but to get people to go out and vote. Fortunately, as Michael said, San Diego has a high voter turnout, and we really want to maintain that for this upcoming general election. On each of these slides, you'll see at the bottom, we're putting our volunteer needs. So if you're interested in helping the league, we have these needs for each particular program. The second program is one of our longest traditions, and that's the candidate forum. So we have organizations that come to the league and ask us to come in and facilitate a candidate forum. We provide a nonpartisan, fair forum for candidates to present their arguments. We have one coming up, which is July the 2nd. It's a mayoral forum with the Claremont Town Council. And it's exciting because we are doing this virtually for the first time. I think what's exciting about what's happened is that by creating these virtual formats, we're now going to be able to reach larger audiences, and we're going to find ways to do this on an ongoing basis, in person hopefully, but also providing video access for those communities that we usually can't reach, or providing access to those who can't come to an in-person event. So I think this is very exciting in the direction that we're going. In addition, we do prop talks, and prop talks are when our speakers are trained on ballot measures and initiatives that are coming out. Usually they'll be out in September, and we'll do a whole month of prop talks. And again, these are requests that people or organizations make for us to come out and speak to you on basically the pros and cons of a measure. And we train people. We have shadow people who assist, and This year, we will be doing virtual recordings. We're doing a partnership with the libraries. And again, all of this is to provide more outreach and getting into the communities that we traditionally are not in. Lastly, our big push for the year, for the whole state is Voter's Edge. And this is an incredible piece. This is one of the things that got me involved with the League because I just love this program. This is, you put in your ballot, your address information, as you can see in this area, and you get all your ballot information that you need. It will give you all the candidates, give you information about the candidates, all bipartisan information, and you can track your information and even change that as time goes before you actually complete your ballot and mail it in. So I highly recommend you look at this. It's one of our, I'd like to say, premier pieces, and we do need people to help. The candidates do have to volunteer their information, so that is one area that volunteers are greatly needed in ensuring that the candidates do put their information in. It's really a great piece. This is how you can stay connected with us, and like I said, we'll be promoting as much as we can and providing that information through the voter and our website. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for all the work that you do for the League and all those other organizations. We're quite impressed. You must be a busy lady. Thank you also to everyone for attending. We always enjoy. We've got lots of people here today, and we like to share this information with you and to hear your interesting questions. It's always a good time for us. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.